Welcome back to Whispers in the Dark. Settle in, lower the lights, and listen closely. In the old days of Edinburgh, when the city still crouched beneath its smoke, with a face half medieval and half modern, there were lanes so narrow that daylight entered them only as a tired rumor. The high houses leaned toward one another like conspirators. Their upper windows nearly touched. Their lower floors sweated dampness. Filth gathered in the seams of the stones, and the reek of tallow, cheap gin, rotting straw, and wet wool drifted through the closes like a permanent fog. Above these dark arteries, the higher streets carried the traffic of gentlemen, students, and physicians. Below them, hidden in the underbelly of the town, life festered in cellars, in garrets, in taverns where men drank to silence, and in rooms where the sick died quietly enough that no one marked the hour. It was a city of learning, they said, a city of reason, a city where science moved boldly against ignorance. Yet beneath the polished speech of its lecturers, and behind the clean cuffs of its surgeons, there ran another current, filthy and cold as the water under a crypt door. For knowledge in those days had a hunger, and that hunger was for bodies. Fettes knew this before he knew it in words. As a young man, he had arrived in Edinburgh with a quick mind, a ready memory, and the loose conscience of one who believed himself too clever to be stained by ordinary sins. He was broad-shouldered, rough-tongued, and handsome in a coarse, self-assured way. He drank early and often. He laughed loudly. He took offense quickly and forgot it just as quickly. His talents were real enough, but his discipline was thin, and where another student might have trembled before a moral question, Fettes often shrugged. The world seemed to him a machine that rewarded nerve. If others hesitated, he would step forward. That quality, more than brilliance, drew the notice of the celebrated Professor K. Among the medical students of the city, Professor K was spoken of with a mixture of admiration and unease. His lectures were crowded. His demonstrations were famous. His hand was steady, his eye cold, his knowledge formidable. He had about him the force of a man who expected obedience as naturally as he expected breath. He could charm a hall one moment and silence it the next with a glance sharp enough to cut. To those he favored, advancement seemed near. To those he rebuked, humiliation could linger for years. It was whispered that he asked no troublesome questions when useful specimens appeared on his table. It was also whispered that men who served him well prospered. Fettes became one of those men. He was made an assistant in the anatomical rooms, trusted with keys, records, and the reception of certain deliveries that arrived before dawn and left no paper trail a respectable clerk would care to see. The dissecting rooms lay in a part of the city where the windows were high, the walls thick, and the very air seemed steeped in spirits and corruption. By day there were students' chatter, the scrape of stools, the glint of instruments laid out in rows like silver teeth. By night, the place changed its nature. The lamps burned lower. Shadows lengthened among the tables. Glass jars caught the light with a sickly gleam. The smell became almost unbearable, a mingling of chemicals, opened flesh, stale blood, damp stone, and the indescribable sweetness of decay. The dead lay under sheets, shape beneath linen, waiting for the curious knife. Fettes did not begin as a monster. Few men do. At first there had been revulsion. Then there had been familiarity. After that came jesting. The body, once a holy and singular thing, became an object, a lesson, a commodity. A shoulder was a muscle group. A hand was articulation. A face was merely skin over structure, unless it happened to be one he recognized. That moment came sooner than it should have. One dark morning, before the bells had properly announced the day, a knocking sounded at the outer door of the rooms. It was a furtive, impatient signal, known too well to Fettes. He cursed softly, rose from a narrow truckle bed in the porter's room where he often slept in his clothes, and took up the lantern. The corridors beyond were chill enough to bite his teeth together. The walls sweated with night damp. Somewhere a drop of water fell at intervals, so regular it seemed like the ticking of a hidden clock. When he opened the door, 2 men stood outside with a sack between them. They were the sort of men who seemed bred out of darkness and gin. Their faces were bruised by weather, drink, and old violence. One had a flattened nose and tiny eyes sunk deep in a red, swollen face. The other wore a hat pulled low and kept working his jaw, as if chewing on some private ill temper. Mud clung to their boots. Their coats smelled of the street, of horse dung, grave earth, and rain. They brought the sack in without ceremony and dropped it upon a table. Money changed hands. The men left. Fettes drew the cord loose and pulled back the rough covering. For a moment, he only stared. Then the room seemed to tighten around him. The dead face before him was not swollen with age, nor wasted with disease, nor anonymous in the way of most poor cadavers delivered to that place. It was a young woman. Her hair, dark and abundant, had been clumsily bundled, but now spilled partly free, catching on the coarse fabric like river weed on stone. Her features were still fresh. Her lips were bruised. One eye was not fully closed. Her skin bore marks no grave made. Around the throat, there was a discoloration that fingers, not time, had left behind. He knew her, Jane Galbraith. She had been seen alive only yesterday, laughing and talking in a public house, well known to several students. No sickly creature near death, but hearty, warm, and vividly alive. Fettes had heard her voice. He could have sworn to the curve of her cheek and the small pale scar near one brow. Now she lay on the slab with that hideous stillness no sleep ever wore. He stood rooted, lantern light shaking in his hand. The practical mind in him leaped first toward denial. Perhaps he was mistaken. Perhaps there was some resemblance. Perhaps the marks had another cause. But the truth pressed in from every angle. The freshness of the body, the violence written in the neck, the brutal carelessness of the delivery, the impossible speed with which a woman alive yesterday had become a specimen before dawn. He covered her again and went in search of counsel. The man he found was Macfarlane. If Fettes had been coarse, Macfarlane was polished. If Fettes blustered, Macfarlane smiled. He was younger than some of the senior students, yet already carried himself with the cool assurance of one born to command. His clothes were neat. His speech was measured. His face was pale and intelligent, with a handsome severity sharpened by amusement. There were those who admired him instantly, and those who disliked him without quite knowing why. He had talent beyond dispute, and ambition enough to freeze his blood without diminishing his pulse. Professor K held him in conspicuous favor. To Fettes, Macfarlane was at once a superior, a rival, and a companion in corruption. They had drank together, laughed together, and shared the same silences before questionable deliveries. Yet, where Fettes still possessed moments of discomfort, Macfarlane seemed to have passed wholly into another climate. He could look upon ugly necessities as a butcher looks at carcasses, not cruelly perhaps, but with utter indifference to any sentiment that did not serve his purpose. When Fettes told him there was trouble, Macfarlane followed him to the table, lifted the cloth, and gazed down at Jane Galbraith. Not a muscle in his face betrayed surprise, only his eyes, very slightly narrowed, then rose to meet Fettes. "You know her," said Fettes in a low voice. "I know what is before us," said Macfarlane. "She was alive yesterday. So were we all. There are marks on her throat. There are often marks. She has been murdered." At that, Macfarlane did smile, though faintly, and there was in it such contempt for panic that Fettes felt heat rise in his face. "My dear fellow," said Macfarlane, "the point is not what happened before she came here. The point is what happens now." Fettes stared at him. The lamp threw an upward light beneath Macfarlane's cheekbones, making the man look almost skull-like for an instant. "We should tell someone," Fettes said. "Whom do you propose to tell?" "The police." "And say what?" "That we purchase subjects by night from men whose names we do not ask. That our distinguished school receives them at the back door before dawn. That Professor K and his assistants have been occupying themselves under a small cloud of profitable ignorance. You may certainly take that course if you have an appetite for ruin." Fettes said nothing. Macfarlane reached out and calmly adjusted the cloth over Jane's face again, as one might straighten a sheet over disordered goods. "You are not paid to judge," he said. "You are paid to receive. Pay. Enter the account. Forget the face." "I cannot." "You can, you will. We all do." There was no argument in the room then, only the distant moan of wind in some chimney, and the faint clink of glass as a draught stirred the hanging instruments. Fettes looked again at the still shape on the table and felt something inside him recoil. Yet another something, weaker but more habitual, calculated consequences. Dismissal, exposure, ridicule, the wrath of Professor K, the collapse of the career he had imagined for himself. When he did not move, Macfarlane placed a hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me, Fettes. There are men in this world who make discoveries, and men who whimper about the means. Which are you? These scruples are an illness of inexperience. Cure yourself of them quickly, or be cured by others less kindly. Then, with methodical precision, he opened the ledger, dipped the pen, and wrote the necessary entry. He counted out the money already paid. He balanced the column. He blotted the page. The matter, in the books at least, was finished. So Jane Galbraith passed into the rooms and out again by pieces. Her face was no longer visible after that day. Her identity dissolved beneath the knives of education, under the eager hands of students who never knew her name and cared less. Yet for Fettes, her memory did not dissolve. It lingered like a stain the lamp could not quite expose. He tried to drink it down. He tried to laugh with the others. He tried, above all, not to watch Macfarlane too closely. But he watched him, and the more he watched, the more he was troubled by the ease with which that man moved through every ambiguity. Macfarlane gambled, joked, studied, and excelled. He could discuss vascular structures with brilliance, raise a glass with grace, and speak of a human body as if it were timber to be measured and cut. There was no visible burden upon him. If he had known fear once, he had taught it to sit quietly in a locked chamber of the heart. Time passed. More bodies came, some old, some young, some plainly exhumed from the churchyard, with clay in the hair and coffin splinters caught in garments. Others were too fresh, too unmarked by burial, too suspiciously acquired. Fettes learned not to ask. Yet all the while a kind of moral mildew spread within him. He was never quite at rest. Night knocking at the door would wake him before the sound itself. A footfall in the corridor would set his nerves briefly on edge. He drank harder. He slept worse. Sometimes he thought he smelled grave soil in rooms far from the school, or heard, under the ordinary noises of the city, some buried scraping, as though a nail dragged lightly along the underside of a lid. Then came Gray. Mr. Gray was no corpse at first. He entered the story alive and in uproarious spirits, a coarse, powerful man of uncertain age with a face both jovial and dangerous. He had the complexion of one who drank deeply, the confidence of one acquainted with violence, and the manners of a bully who enjoyed performing good humor before witnesses. He made friends easily because he imposed himself before one could refuse him. His laugh was immense. His eye was bold. He slapped backs, shouted for wine, and spoke to gentlemen as though he might at any moment drag them into a ditch for sport. He took a liking to Macfarlane, though whether out of genuine affection, blackmail, shared history, or some uglier bond, Fettes could not tell. The first time Fettes saw them together at an inn, the contrast struck him sharply. Gray lounged with his cup in hand and mud on his boots, vast and ruddy, and offensively at home. Macfarlane sat opposite, elegant as ever, but not easy. That was what caught Fettes's attention. Not fear exactly, but strain. Gray called him Toddy, and every time he used the name, some small hard line appeared beside Macfarlane's mouth. "Toddy will pay," Gray said loudly to the company. Macfarlane laughed. "If it pleases you." "It does please me," said Gray. "Everything pleases me tonight." And indeed Macfarlane paid, not only for Gray's food and drink, but for Gray's horse, Gray's comfort, Gray's amusement. He submitted to insults polished into jokes. He bore familiarities no proud man should have suffered from such lips. Yet at intervals, his gaze fell on Gray with such an expressionless coldness that Fettes, observing from across the room, felt his own skin tighten. It was the look of a man counting. Some days later, Macfarlane invited Fettes to supper and much wine. The evening stretched late. Their room was private, the fire low, the candles burning down. Outside, rain hissed faintly against the panes. Macfarlane was in rare spirits, talking with unusual freedom, mocking rivals, imitating professors, drawing laughter even from the sour corners of Fettes's mood. They drank. The bottle emptied. Another appeared. Then, somewhere deep into the night, there came a thunderous knocking below. Not the furtive knock of the resurrection men. A public, impudent pounding. Macfarlane went still. He set down his glass. Again the knocking came, followed by a voice from the street, thick and unmistakable. "Toddy." Macfarlane's jaw clenched once. Then he smiled. "An inconvenience," he said. "I must go to my friend." He took his hat and cloak and went out into the wet night. Fettes remained with the dying fire and the half-cleared table. At first, he was mildly entertained, then annoyed, then sleepy. The room grew close. Candle grease ran in long tiers. The shadows of chair backs stretched across the floor like prison bars. He did not know how long had passed when he heard steps on the stair. Only one man came up. Macfarlane entered, pale beneath the flush of drink and rain. "Gray?" Fettes asked. "Gone." The answer was too quick. Macfarlane removed his wet gloves finger by finger and laid them neatly on the mantel. His movements were exact, almost ceremonious. There was mud on one cuff and something darker. Fettes stared at it. Macfarlane saw him stare and turned the cuff inward. "You look as if you had seen an apparition," said Macfarlane. "Where is he?" Macfarlane poured himself wine with a hand that was entirely steady. "Ask me no questions tonight." The next morning, before full dawn, the knock came at the anatomical rooms. Fettes woke from a troubled doze and felt, before memory returned, a wave of animal dread. He took up the lantern and went to the door. A cart stood there. Macfarlane was with it, alone. "There is work to do," he said. His voice was low, clipped, and left no space for refusal. Together they brought in the burden, heavy and unwieldy, wrapped in a cloak and tied at the feet. The room was cold enough that their breath smoked. Somewhere in the building timbers gave a soft, contracting crack. The lamp flame bent and straightened as doors opened and shut. Fettes's hands had begun to shake. On the central table, Macfarlane untied the cords and folded back the covering. Gray lay beneath. His huge face, so lately red with drink and noise, had gone to an obscene modeling. The jaw sagged. The lips were drawn slightly back from the teeth, as if in the beginning of a grin too dreadful to complete. One temple was crushed inward. The skin there was broken. Black hair, sticky with blood, clung to the wound. On the throat, there were bruises. One eye was closed, the other remained half open, with a glazed accusation that no lid had fully conquered. Fettes recoiled so violently that he struck the instrument tray behind him, sending steel ringing to the floor. "You devil," he whispered. Macfarlane's face might have been cut from old ivory. "I have done for you before," he said. "Will you now do for me?" Fettes could not speak. "You are in this up to the chin," Macfarlane continued. "Do not feign innocence. There is no distinction worth nomming between one body and another, except that this one can be more dangerous if mishandled. Control yourself." "Murderer." Macfarlane stepped close in a single swift movement, and for an instant Fettes thought he would be struck down where he stood. Instead, Macfarlane spoke softly, almost kindly, and that kindness was more terrible than rage. "Call me what you please when we are safe, but if you lose your head now, I shall save myself and let you hang. Remember Jane Galbraith if you need a lesson in timing." The name, hissed in that place over Gray's dead body, seemed to poison the air. Fettes turned away, both hands pressed against the edge of the table until the wood bit his palms. He felt sick. He felt trapped. He felt all the doors of his previous complicity closing behind him one by one. Macfarlane was right. He had accepted money. He had entered false accounts. He had kept silence. Morally, there might still be degrees among the damned, but to the gallows rope, such distinctions were trifles. When he could look again, Gray's fixed eyes seemed still to seek his own, and the ruin at the temple shone wetly in the lamplight. There was blood dried in the hairline and under one ear. The powerful neck, once so full of life and insolence, now bent with a dead heaviness no man can imitate in sleep. His hands were partly clenched. The nails were dirty, broken at the edges, and one bore a crescent clogged dark, with skin or cloth torn from whatever struggle had ended him. Fettes shut his eyes. "Do what you must," he muttered. So they did what they had done before. The account was made to balance. The necessary arrangements were completed. Gray, like Jane Galbraith, was swallowed by the educational appetite of the school, but the destruction of his body did not destroy him. Far from it. From that morning onward, he seemed to spread through Fettes's nerves like a contagion. He saw the man in dreams constantly, though rarely in the same shape twice. Sometimes Gray stood at the foot of his bed, with the crushed side of his skull hidden in shadow, only the wet brightness of the visible eye fixed upon him. Sometimes he came as he had been in life, laughing and calling for Toddy, but when he turned, the back of his head was open like a butchered animal. At other times, Fettes dreamed of the dissecting room itself, where all the cadavers sat upright on their slabs, sheeted and patient, and Gray among them, with his great broken head, tilted as if listening for instructions from beneath the earth. He drank more savagely. He neglected his studies. His face bloated. His temper worsened. The confidence of youth began to rot away, leaving irritability and fear. As for Macfarlane, he flourished. That was the horror of it. He prospered. He advanced. He mastered his courses. He moved among men with the same detached skill as ever. If he suffered inwardly, he gave no sign. On the contrary, he sometimes appeared lighter, as though some long-standing burden had been removed the night gray vanished from the world. Yet there were moments when Fettes caught him unawares, and saw a different expression, brief but unmistakable. A listening look, taut and inward, as if some remembered knock had sounded just below hearing. Their friendship did not survive in any ordinary sense after Gray's death. They remained linked by dread and mutual knowledge, but trust between them was impossible. They drank together less often. When they did speak privately, each seemed to probe the other's resolve. Fettes hated Macfarlane, yet clung to him as men chained together in a flood may hate and clutch at once. Eventually, the old life broke apart. Professor K continued his triumphs. Students came and went. Bodies arrived. Seasons changed. Fettes drifted downward with alarming speed, from promise to dissipation, from dissipation to disgrace. Whether through drink, scandal, neglect, or the steady self-sabotage of a conscience too corrupted for peace and too weak for repentance, he lost his footing in the profession. The man who might have become a physician became instead a wreck of one. Years passed. The brilliant student Macfarlane became the established Dr. Wolfe Macfarlane, prosperous and respected. Fettes sank into a meaner existence, living hard and low, carrying in his body the marks of habitual indulgence, and in his mind an old chamber that no time sealed shut. The city around them altered, as cities do. New faces came. Old closes were repaired or demolished. Reputations rose and hardened into fact. But the past did not die merely because the living changed address. It waited. One winter evening, long after those nights in the anatomical rooms, Fettes sat in a small public house over his drink. The place was low and warm and unclean. Smoke thickened near the ceiling. The floor was scattered with straw gone black at the edges. A fire crouched in the grate, eating slowly through damp coal and giving off more smell than comfort. Men spoke in subdued voices. Now and then someone laughed too loudly, and the sound died quickly, as if the room itself disliked gaiety. Fettes was not yet old, but ruin had aged him beyond his years. His face was heavy and swollen. His skin had the discolored grain of long abuse. His eyes, though still keen at moments, were ringed and sunken. There are men whose vice softens them into helplessness, and men whom it makes ferocious. In Fettes it had done both by turns. Tonight he sat hunched, one broad hand around his glass, his thoughts muddled until a stir at the door drew his head up. A gentleman had entered, well dressed for travel, accompanied by others who treated him with deference. Something in the carriage, the profile, the pale exactness of the features struck Fettes like a hand at the back of the neck. Macfarlane. Time had altered him less kindly than success promised. He was still elegant. He was still composed, but his hair had thinned. His face, once merely pale, had grown dry and fine, like something carved and kept too long in a cabinet. His eye remained active, intelligent, and guarded. He had the look of a man who has kept his place in the world by perpetual self-command. To anyone else, he was a distinguished physician. To Fettes, he was the same toddy with darkness under the skin. Recognition passed between them like a blade flashed in lamplight. Macfarlane faltered only for an instant. Then he approached, all civility. "Surely this is an old friend," he said. Fettes stared up at him without rising. The men with Macfarlane seemed curious, but uncertain. The public house, sensing some unusual current, fell quieter. Macfarlane spoke warmly, too warmly, offering remembrance, concern, even money, in a tone that might have sounded charitable to strangers. But the false friendliness only fed the old rage fermenting in Fettes's chest. He saw again Jane on the slab. He saw Gray with the crushed temple and the open eye. He saw ledger entries made in calm ink, while the dead still held the night's chill in their limbs. At last Fettes said, in a voice thick with drink, yet horribly distinct, "Have you seen it again?" Macfarlane's color changed. The room listened, without understanding. "I do not know what you mean," he said. Fettes leaned forward. "The thing we saw, have you seen it again?" Macfarlane's mouth tightened into that old, dangerous line. "Be silent," he said. But silence had decayed too long in Fettes. Words forced their way up from where he had buried them, not coherent confession, but accusation, memory, poison. He called Macfarlane by the old diminutive Gray had used. He hinted at graves, at tables, at things received in darkness. He said enough to wound, and not enough to explain. The physician tried first to soothe, then to threaten, then to buy him off. Fettes laughed in his face, a bloated ruin laughing at a successful man before witnesses. The meeting ended badly, as such meetings do. Macfarlane withdrew in visible agitation. Fettes remained shaking, triumphant, and sickened at once. The old wound, once torn open, had begun to bleed afresh. Yet the deepest terror of the tale lies not merely in these recollections, dreadful as they are. It lies in what happened on the road between those earlier years and this encounter in the public house, on a night when Fettes and Macfarlane had still been bound together in their unholy trade. That night had come after Gray's death, though not long after. The school again had need of subjects, and the usual suppliers had failed them. There was word of a woman lately buried in a country kirkyard some miles from the city, in poor soil, shallow laid, little guarded, likely to answer their purpose. Macfarlane proposed the expedition himself. Fettes, uneasy from the outset, wished to refuse, but refusal had become difficult between them. One did not easily deny the man who knew how much one had already accepted. So toward evening, they set out with a small gig, tools concealed, and the sort of hard practicality men wear when pretending not to know they journey toward damnation. The weather worsened steadily as they left the city behind. Fields stretched black under a sky of low-moving cloud. Hedgerows clawed at the roadside. Bare branches crossed overhead like the ribs of a giant carcass. The wind rose and fell in mournful gusts that carried rain first as mist, then as sharp spitting needles, then as full cold sheets that rattled on the gig and soaked cloak and glove alike. Wheels jolted in ruts. The horse tossed its head and snorted steam into the dark. They reached the kirkyard near midnight. It was an ancient place, uneven and crowded, with stones leaning at all angles and old inscriptions eaten by lichen and weather, until the names seemed to be sinking back into the rock. A line of yews blackened one side. Beyond them lay open country and a scatter of low farms, their distant lights smeared by rain. The church itself was a squat dark bulk against a darker sky, with narrow windows and a roof from which water dripped steadily. Here and there, the ground had slumped over older burials, giving the whole place a look not merely neglected, but restless, as if what lay beneath had shifted in sleep. They found the fresh grave by lantern light. Mound was easy enough to identify, the earth scarcely settled, the clay loose. Fettes held the lantern while Macfarlane set to work with brutal efficiency. Soon Fettes, cursing under his breath and shivering with more than cold, joined him. Spade bit into wet soil. Mud sucked at their boots. Rain ran down their necks and into their sleeves. The smell rose powerful and raw, fresh earth mixed with the mold of long buried ground. Worms gleamed and twisted in the lantern beam. Roots came up like blackened veins. Beneath each thrust of metal, there seemed to wait not wood, but resistance of another kind, a human reluctance. At length, the spade struck the coffin, a hollow sound, muffled yet distinct. They cleared the lid, pried it free, and under the rain-glazed lamplight looked down upon the wrapped form within. Neither man spoke. There is a difference between digging earth and touching what earth has so recently taken. The silence became thick, almost ceremonial despite them. Fettes felt his stomach turn. The face below was veiled in burial cloth, yet the shape of the head, the folded hands, the dreadful intimacy of the coffin's narrow confinement moved him with a late and useless pity. They lifted the body out. It was heavier than expected, dead weight, resisting every effort with a limp obstinacy that made them both breathe hard. The winding sheet was slickened by damp. Mud stained it. Something in the form shifted unpleasantly as they maneuvered it into a sack. When at last they had the burden tied and loaded into the gig, their clothes were fouled, their hands numb, their nerves stretched raw by cold and the insane indecency of their labor. They set off at once. The lantern, hung awkwardly, swung and threw monstrous shadows over horse, hedge, and wheel. Rain drove slantwise across the road. The sack lay between them in the back of the gig, long mute, and yet never still in the imagination. Every jolt altered its outline. Every rut made it seem to settle by degrees into a more human accusation. For some time, neither spoke. Only the wheels, the rain, and the breathing of the horse accompanied them. Then Fettes, desperate to break the oppression of the silence, said something trivial about the woman's age, the difficulty of the soil, the badness of the road. Macfarlane answered shortly. Presently, they tried a flask. The spirits burned, but did not warm. The darkness seemed to crowd closer. At intervals, Fettes had the irrational certainty that the sack behind them had changed position, though each time he looked it lay as before. "Speak of something else," he said at last. Macfarlane muttered a curse. The horse shied violently at some roadside shape, then recovered. In the lantern swing, the sack thudded against the sideboard of the gig, with a soft, fleshy impact that made both men start. "Secure it better," Macfarlane snapped. Fettes reached back with both hands, feeling through wet coarse cloth the form within. He froze. This was no narrow-shouldered countrywoman. No slight, dead body laid out for burial. There was width there, mass a torso too large, limbs too powerful. The rain hissed louder. Or perhaps it was only blood in his ears. "What is it?" said Macfarlane. Fettes did not answer. He passed one trembling hand over what should have been the face. The features beneath the sack were not those of the corpse they had lifted from the coffin. The head was larger, the jaw more pronounced. There seemed even through the wrappings some terrible ruin or irregularity to one side. Cold seized him from within. "Macfarlane," he whispered. No reply. "Macfarlane, there is something wrong." The doctor checked the horse and turned. In the swaying dark, his face looked corpse pale already. "What nonsense now. Feel it." For an instant, Macfarlane did not move, as though some knowledge already stirred in him, and he preferred not to confirm it. But at last, he reached back. His gloved hands encountered the same impossible bulk. The road fell silent, except for rain dripping from the gig. Far away, a dog barked once and was still. Neither man breathed normally. With enormous reluctance, Macfarlane seized the lantern from its hook and held it near the sack. The light shuddered across wet cloth, knotted rope, splashed mud. Fettes, his fingers clumsy and almost insensible, began to untie the fastening. The rope slipped. Twice he failed. At last it loosened. Together they drew back the sack. The lantern flame jerked in the wind and cast a jumping yellow glare over the face within. Mr. Gray looked up at them. Dead, of course. Dead beyond question, but there was Gray. Not the country woman from the kirkyard. Not any recent burial of the district. Gray, with the great vulgar features horribly familiar even in death. Gray, with the swollen lips. Gray, with the half-open eye. Gray, with the crushed temple black and dreadful as when first laid on the table in the anatomical rooms. Rain washed over the corpse's face, collecting in the broken depression of the skull before spilling down the cheek. Mud streaked the forehead. The hair was plastered dark and lank. The mouth had fallen further open than before so that several teeth showed, and the expression was no longer the beginning of a grin, but its rotten completion. One stiffened hand, forced somehow against the sack's fold, seemed poised as if to clutch. Fettes made a sound no grown man should make. Macfarlane's face collapsed into naked terror. The lantern dropped. Darkness crashed over them. The horse, maddened by the sudden movement, the shout, perhaps by some scent carried from the opened sack, reared and lunged. The gig swayed violently. Fettes felt himself hurled sideways. A wheel struck stone. Wood splintered. Something heavy shifted behind him with a thud he would hear in dreams forever. Then came chaos. Hooves striking, harness snapping, mud, cold water. The whole world reduced to blind struggle, while somewhere close at hand, a dead thing from a dissecting room rode again through the storm. By the time Fettes clawed himself upright in the road, the horse had bolted partway and stood trembling in the traces. The gig was half overturned. The lantern had gone out. Macfarlane was on his knees in the mud, making sounds like choked breathing or prayer. The sack had burst open further, though in the blackness little could be clearly seen, except when lightning tore the sky for an instant, the pale, obscene oval of Gray's face shining from the wreck like something newly dug from hell. Neither man proposed to examine it again. They righted what they could, abandoned what they must, and fled that road with a panic no reason could have restrained. Whether the body remained in the broken gig, whether it rolled into the ditch, whether it was ever found by any mortal eye, Fettes never rightly knew. He only knew that from that night onward Gray ceased to belong merely to memory and entered the kingdom of visitations. Had they robbed the wrong grave? Impossible. Fettes had seen the woman in the coffin. Had they by drink and terror mistaken some ordinary corpse for Gray? Impossible. The crushed temple, the face, the size, the very abominable familiarity of the thing admitted no doubt. Had some human enemy contrived the exchange to torment them? That explanation failed under the sheer delirious impossibility of the circumstances. No one had followed them. No one could have known. And yet there Gray was. Thus the secret core of Fettes's horror was not only murder, it was return. Years later in the public house, when he asked Macfarlane whether he had seen it again, this was the it he meant. Not merely a corpse, not merely Gray, but the fact that what they had done had not stayed done, that the dead, once sufficiently wronged, might refuse the positions allotted them by science, law, or burial. Macfarlane never answered him truly. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps he had indeed seen Gray again in corridors, in mirrors, at the foot of hotel beds, sitting silent in hired carriages opposite him. Perhaps every knock after midnight had become to him the old thunderous summons from the street. Perhaps each patient with a head wound, each swollen face on a fevered pillow, each half-closed eye in the morgue, had for one beating instant been that same impossible revenant. No man can live untouched by such things, however smooth his waistcoat. And what of Fettes? He outlived reputation, ambition, and nearly every hope respectable men call a life. But survival is not escape. The mind stores what the conscience cannot digest. There were nights when he woke with his heart racing so hard he believed some hand had reached under his ribs. There were evenings when drink almost freed him, only for the firelight to strike a face across the room in such a way that he tasted grave earth in his mouth. He began at times to mutter names when alone: Jane, Gray, Toddy. He avoided kirkyards. He avoided medical men. He avoided dark sacks, rope knots, and any road bordered by yews. Yet memory is itself a body snatcher. It steals the dead from where we have hidden them and lays them fresh before us. Sometimes, late and sodden with whiskey, Fettes tried to reason with his own mind. He told himself that fear had distorted the roadside discovery. He told himself guilt had furnished Gray's features to some other corpse. He told himself men under strain can see impossible things. But whenever such thoughts began to settle, another image would rise with intolerable clarity. Rainwater shining in the crushed temple, and that half-open eye regarding him from the sack with cold familiarity, as if Gray were not surprised to find his killers once again at work in the dark. The city, for all its noise and business, is a lonely place for the haunted. Crowds do not save a man from what walks within him. Fettes learned this too well. The living jostled, bargained, preached, laughed, courted, and died around him. And all the while his true companions remained those others, the violated dead, the bodies turned into coin, lesson, ladder, or inconvenience. He had not struck the fatal blow, perhaps. He had not dug every grave. Yet he had opened the door, taken the money, written the lies. Piece by piece, he had taught himself indifference, until indifference became complicity, and complicity curdled into fear. There is a kind of justice in that, not legal justice, which can be cheated, not social justice, which can be bought, but the slow inward justice by which a human being becomes the shape of what he consents to. Macfarlane, too, paid his price, though not before the world had richly rewarded him. Men praised his skill, trusted his judgment, perhaps even loved him in the shallow way reserved for eminent professionals. Yet, if terror ever once possessed him on that road, then under all his honors there remained an unquiet tenant. One may command servants, horses, students, and disease. One may not forever command remembrance. The dead are patient. The mind that wrongs them is their most obedient grave. And so, when next you hear of old Edinburgh and its famous schools, think not only of bright lecture halls and noble progress. Think also of the closes before dawn. Think of the furtive cartwheel at the back gate. Think of a young woman named Jane Galbraith, alive at dusk and on the slab by morning. Think of the jovial brute Gray, who laughed too loudly, knew too much, and did not stay buried in any ordinary sense. Think of Fettes, who sold his peace a little at a time. Think of Wolfe Macfarlane, brilliant, elegant, and inwardly damned. Think of the lamps burning in those stone rooms, while outside the city slept, and within the dead waited under linen. For horror is never merely blood, nor merely the opened grave, nor merely the violence done in darkness. The truest horror lies in the moment a man understands that he has crossed so far into evil that even his fear can no longer make him innocent. It lies in the knowledge that some acts are not finished when completed. They continue, they revisit, they knock again. And if, on some wet and solitary road, with the horse uneasy and the trees writhing overhead, you should hear behind you a soft shifting in the burden you believe to be tied fast, do not turn too quickly. There are some faces no lantern should ever reveal twice. Thank you for listening. If this tale held you to the end, then keep the fire burning a little longer tonight, and listen closely to every sound your house makes after midnight. A settling board, a tap at the glass, a step where no one should be. Old stories have a way of lingering, especially those fed by guilt and grave earth. Until next time, good night, and mind what answers when the darkness knocks.
Whispers of a love so true, painting dreams of me and you. And I'll hold you close in this moment.